The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the roof of James Callahan's small ranch house. The wind howled as if it had a life of its own, pushing the storm into every corner of the landscape. Inside the cabin, the warm glow of a fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. James Callahan sat at the table, his rough hands absently turning a mug in his palm. His daughter Ellie sat across from him, her bright eyes focused on the book she was reading by the light of the oil lamp. James was used to the solitude of life on his ranch. Ever since his wife had passed away, giving birth to Ellie, it had just been the two of them. They lived a quiet, simple life. There were long days spent working the land, feeding the animals, and mending fences. James wasn't one for conversation, much, but he found peace in the steady rhythm of the work. The silence of the ranch suited him, and he was content with his little family. Still, there were nights like this, cold and stormy, when he felt the weight of the years pressing on him, and he wished things were different. He glanced over at Ellie, her small face lit up by the flickering light. At only 8 years old, she already had a curious mind, always asking questions, always wanting to know more. She wasn't much like James, quiet and reserved. Instead, she was full of life and energy, always running around, always wanting to learn something new. She was his everything. As he looked at her, a soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. James furrowed his brow. In all his years on the ranch, he'd never had many visitors. The closest neighbor was miles away, and most of the people in the area preferred to keep to themselves. But as the wind howled outside and the rain continued to pour, he could tell that whoever was at his door was either desperate or in need of shelter. He stood up slowly, glancing at Ellie, who had already set her book down and was watching him curiously. James made his way to the door and hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. The sight that greeted him was unexpected. Standing on his doorstep was a woman, drenched to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her face, and her clothes soaked through. She was thin, her face pale and drawn, and she looked like she had been traveling for far too long. "Can I help you?" James asked, his voice steady but cautious. He wasn't one to invite strangers into his home, especially not in a storm like this. But there was something about her that made him pause. The woman lifted her head, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment James felt a flicker of something deep within him. A sense of urgency, a sense of worry. She didn't seem to be a threat, but the way she looked at him, as though she had been lost for days, made him uneasy. "My name is Taya," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been traveling, and I'm in need of shelter for the night. I don't know where else to go." James studied her for a moment, unsure of what to do. It wasn't often that people came through this way, especially at this time of year when the weather was so unforgiving. He could see she was cold and exhausted, and something inside him told him to help her. "Come in, get out of the rain," he said finally, stepping aside to allow her to enter. Taya stepped in quickly, gratefully, and James shut the door behind her, shutting out the storm. The warmth of the fire inside seemed to take her by surprise, and she stood for a moment, allowing the heat to seep into her bones. James could see that she was exhausted, and he couldn't help but feel sympathy for her. He had no idea who she was or where she came from, but there was a certain vulnerability in her eyes that made him want to offer her some comfort. "I'm James Callahan," he said, breaking the silence. "This is my daughter, Ellie." Ellie, who had been watching the exchange closely, gave a small wave to the stranger. Taya smiled at the little girl, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked around the room, taking in the small cabin, the worn furniture, and the simple life that James had built. It was clear she wasn't used to this kind of comfort, but she didn't say anything. "You're welcome to sit by the fire and dry off," James offered, motioning toward a chair near the hearth. "I'll get you something warm to drink." Taya nodded, too tired to say much, and sank gratefully into the chair by the fire. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and James could tell she was doing everything she could to keep from falling asleep right then and there. He moved quietly around the cabin, getting her a cup of warm tea and a blanket to help her warm up. Ellie had already gone to the small kitchen to set the table, humming softly to herself. The rain continued to pour outside, and the wind howled around the cabin. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but James was determined to make the best of the situation. He had never been one to ignore the needs of others, even if he didn't know them. It was simply who he was. After a few minutes, Taya took the cup of tea James had prepared for her, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, but filled with gratitude. James nodded but didn't say much. He was a man of few words, especially when it came to matters like this, but there was something about her presence that made him feel a little uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. He glanced over at Ellie, who was staring at Taya with wide eyes, clearly curious. James could tell that his daughter wanted to ask questions, but she was being polite, sensing that now wasn't the time. Taya seemed to appreciate the quiet kindness, though she still looked distant, her gaze flickering to the window every now and then, as if she was waiting for something. James decided to break the silence. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice gentle but direct. "I don't see many travelers this far out, especially not in a storm like this." Taya hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as if considering whether or not to share her story. She finally spoke, her words measured and careful. I'm from a small village," she said slowly. "I lost my husband not too long ago. He was taken from me, and I've been traveling ever since. I don't have anywhere else to go." James noticed a shadow pass over her face as she spoke. There was a sadness in her voice, a deep sorrow that seemed to weigh her down. Her story was one of loss, and James could feel the quiet pain she carried with her. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly, though the words felt inadequate. Taya gave a small nod, not trusting herself to speak. She looked out the window again as if hoping the storm would pass, and with it, the burden she seemed to carry. But there was more to her story, James could tell. There was something she wasn't saying, something hidden behind those tired eyes. But for the moment he didn't press her. She had come seeking shelter, and that's what he would offer her. She had traveled far, and she was in no condition to leave again, especially not in this storm. "Well," James said, standing up, "I'm sure you're tired. Get some rest. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Taya looked at him, surprised by his kindness. She had expected a cold reception, perhaps even suspicion, but James hadn't treated her like an outsider. She gave him a grateful smile, though it was faint, and settled deeper into her chair by the fire. James returned to his own chair, taking a moment to look at his daughter, who was still studying the woman with wide eyes. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a nagging sense of unease. Something about Taya's story didn't quite add up, but for now he decided not to question it. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin there was a quiet sense of peace for the moment. James Callahan, a man who had learned to trust his instincts over the years, couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything. The night dragged on, the sound of the rain and wind battering the windows mixing with the crackling of the fire. Inside the cabin, the warmth was a welcome contrast to the storm outside. Taya, still sitting by the fire, clutched her mug of tea, its steam rising in the quiet room. She didn't speak much, only occasionally glancing at James and Ellie, but her eyes held a faraway look, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. James noticed the silence between them and couldn't help but wonder what was troubling her. Ellie, who had been unusually quiet since Taya's arrival, now seemed to be studying their guest closely. The little girl had a way of observing people with wide, curious eyes, always trying to understand more than what was on the surface. She had a natural ability to sense when something was wrong, even if it wasn't obvious to anyone else. Tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Taya's story than what she had shared. After a few minutes of silence, Ellie broke the quiet. "Are you hungry?" she asked, her voice gentle. She was always the one to offer food when there was a guest, no matter how little they had. It was her way of making people feel welcome, even if she didn't fully understand them. Taya looked at her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you, little one," she said, her voice kind but weary. "I'm not very hungry, but your offer is kind." Ellie didn't seem discouraged. She was used to people refusing her offers, but she didn't let that stop her. Instead, she set her plate aside and stood up, as if she was ready to help no matter what. James watched his daughter, feeling a mix of pride and concern. He had always been proud of Ellie's caring nature. Even at such a young age, she understood the importance of kindness. But James also knew that the world wasn't always kind, and there were times when such kindness could be taken advantage of. He hoped that wouldn't be the case with Taya. He decided to change the subject, hoping to ease the tension in the room. "You mentioned you were traveling alone," James said, his voice casual but sincere. "That's a long journey, especially in weather like this." Taya's gaze flickered to the window again, her fingers tightening around her mug.
"Yes, it is," she said, her voice distant.
"I've been traveling for several days now. I was with my husband before." She trailed off, her words fading into the quiet air. There was a sadness in her tone that was impossible to miss. James didn't push her to continue. He knew better than to ask too many questions. People often carried heavy burdens, and sometimes the weight of those burdens was something they weren't ready to share. He'd learned that the hard way. Instead, James stood up and moved to the kitchen to prepare something simple for dinner. It wasn't much, just some bread, cheese, and vegetables, but it was enough to share. As he worked, he tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept returning to the woman sitting by the fire. There was something about her that didn't quite add up, something in the way she held herself, in the way her eyes darted around the room when she thought no one was looking. James couldn't put his finger on it, but he sensed that there was more to her story than she had let on. Ellie, who had been silently watching Taya, finally spoke again, her voice full of innocent curiosity. "Where are you from, Miss Taya?" she asked, her eyes wide with genuine interest. Taya turned her head, her gaze softening as she looked at the young girl. "I'm from a small village," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "It's a peaceful place, surrounded by mountains. I grew up there, and my husband and I made our life there." James set the bread on the table and glanced over at Taya. "And what happened to your village?" he asked gently. He could tell that she had been trying to avoid discussing her past, but he felt compelled to understand. It was hard not to be curious when someone's presence felt so heavy, when they seemed to be hiding so much beneath the surface. Taya took a deep breath, then looked at the fire, her eyes distant again. "The world changes quickly," she said, her voice quiet and weary. "My husband and I were happy there, but things changed. People came, men from outside the village. They were not kind, not at all." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "We tried to defend ourselves, to protect what was ours, but we were outnumbered. And in the end, it wasn't just the village we lost. I lost my husband too." James could feel a tightness in his chest as he listened to her words. He didn't know the details, but the pain in her voice told him everything he needed to know. There was more to her story, something dark and haunting, but Taya wasn't ready to share it yet. James could respect that. The room fell silent once again, the crackling fire the only sound in the air. Ellie looked up at James with a puzzled expression. She didn't fully understand the weight of what Taya had said, but she could tell that something about it wasn't right. Children had a way of sensing things, even if they didn't fully grasp the meaning behind them. James decided it was best to let Taya have her space. He didn't want to press her for answers, not tonight. Instead, he carried the plates to the table and motioned for everyone to sit down. The meal was simple, but it was enough to satisfy their hunger. Ellie dug in eagerly, her bright eyes focused on Taya as if she was still trying to figure her out. Taya, however, took her time. She only ate a small portion, picking at the food as if she wasn't truly hungry or perhaps wasn't used to eating so freely. "Are you staying long?" Ellie asked between bites, her innocent question cutting through the quiet. Taya looked at her, her expression softening just a little. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I can't say for sure. I need to keep moving." James was about to ask her why she couldn't stay longer, but something in her voice made him stop. There was a sense of urgency behind her words, a quiet desperation that he couldn't ignore. It made him wonder if she was trying to escape something. Maybe it wasn't just the storm that had brought her here. Maybe she was running from something, or someone. The more James thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't know nearly as much about Taya as he thought. Her story didn't add up, and the way she acted, constantly glancing toward the door or the window, only deepened his suspicion. But for now, he decided to keep his concerns to himself. As the evening wore on, the storm outside showed no sign of letting up. The wind howled, and the rain battered against the windows like a constant reminder of the harsh world outside. Inside, though, there was a strange sense of calm. Taya had stopped looking out the window for a while, her body relaxing slightly in the warmth of the fire. She still seemed troubled, but at least she was no longer on edge. James watched her closely. Something told him that he had opened his door to a stranger with a past that could threaten everything he had. But he also knew that there was nothing he could do to change what had already happened. She was here now, and as long as she was under his roof, he would do what he could to make her feel safe. The night stretched on, and soon enough, Ellie's eyelids grew heavy. She let out a soft yawn, her head drooping until she finally fell asleep at the table, her small body leaning against the chair. James stood up and gently lifted her into his arms, carrying her to her bed. When he returned, Taya was still sitting by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames. She looked lost in thought, and for a brief moment James wondered what it was that weighed so heavily on her heart. He didn't press her to talk, though. Instead, he simply said, "You're welcome to stay here for as long as you need, Taya. You don't have to go anywhere tonight." She turned to look at him, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm grateful for your kindness." James nodded, feeling the weight of the night settle around them. He wasn't sure where this strange encounter would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. His quiet life on the ranch was about to change forever. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin there was a strange stillness, as though time itself was waiting to see what would come next. The wind howled outside, the storm showing no signs of letting up. It battered the walls of the cabin like it was trying to tear them down, but inside the house was warm and still. The fire crackled and popped, its glow casting soft shadows across the room. James sat at the table, his thoughts heavy as he glanced over at Taya, who was still sitting by the fire, her gaze lost in the flames. She had been quiet for most of the evening, and though she looked physically more at ease, there was something about her that seemed distant, as if she was somewhere far away, in a place he couldn't reach. Ellie had long since fallen asleep at the table, her head resting against her arms. James gently lifted her up and carried her to her bed, tucking her in with a soft kiss on her forehead. When he returned to the main room, he found Taya in the same position, her eyes focused on the fire. It was clear that she wasn't planning to sleep anytime soon, and James, though exhausted from a long day, found it hard to rest as well. The unease in the air lingered, making it impossible for James to completely relax. His instincts told him that something wasn't right. Taya's story was incomplete, and there was an underlying tension in her every movement. The way she kept glancing toward the window, the way her fingers would tighten around her mug, as if she were bracing herself for something. He didn't know what it was, but the longer she stayed, the more he felt like they were both waiting for something to happen. James finally stood up from his chair and walked over to the window, looking out into the storm. The rain pounded down, and the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. He tried to see beyond the veil of the storm, but all he could make out were shadows and swirling mist. There was no sign of life out there, just the relentless downpour and wind. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was hard to shake the feeling that Taya was hiding something. She had told him about her husband's death, but there was something she wasn't saying, something she wasn't ready to share, and that made James uneasy. He didn't like secrets. He liked things to be straightforward, to be simple, but he knew that life wasn't always that way. People had histories, and sometimes those histories were full of things they wanted to forget. He turned back to Taya, who hadn't moved since he'd left the room. The firelight made her features seem softer, but there was still an edge to her, something sharp that he couldn't quite understand. He cleared his throat, deciding to try again. "Taya," he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet of the room. "I don't mean to be rude, but you've been through a lot. If you want to talk, I'm here. You don't have to be alone with it." She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked down at the fire for a long moment, her fingers drumming softly against the mug in her hand. James waited, giving her the time and space she needed. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "I don't know if I can talk about it," she said, her eyes still on the flames. "It's hard to explain. It feels like a part of me is Gone, and I don't know how to get it back. My husband, he was everything to me. And now I have nothing, just this emptiness. James listened intently, his heart going out to her. He could hear the pain in her voice, the rawness of her grief. He could understand that. He had lost his wife years ago, and though the wound had healed over time, there was still a hollow space inside him where she used to be. But Taya's grief seemed different. It was deeper, more desperate. She was not just mourning the loss of someone she loved. She was trying to survive without him. I'm sorry, James said quietly, stepping closer to her. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I know what it's like to lose someone. It's not easy, but you don't have to carry that weight alone. Taya finally turned her head to look at him, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was something vulnerable in her eyes. She looked at him as if she were searching for something, some sign of understanding perhaps, or maybe just someone who wouldn't judge her for what she had done. I wasn't always like this, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I wasn't always so lost. But after my husband died, I didn't know how to keep going. I didn't know what to do with myself. So I started traveling. But it's not just that. It's the people who took him from me. James felt a tightening in his chest. He hadn't expected this. What do you mean? He asked, his voice gentle. Taya looked at him for a long moment before replying, her voice barely above a whisper. The people who killed him, they weren't just random outlaws. They were a group of men who went from place to place hurting people, stealing what they could. My husband tried to stop them. And she paused, swallowing hard, as if the words were difficult to say. They killed him, right in front of me. James felt his stomach tighten with sympathy. He had heard stories of such groups, ruthless and heartless, leaving destruction in their wake. He could only imagine what it had been like for Taya to witness such a thing. And yet, despite the pain and loss she had suffered, there was something about her and something about the way she carried herself that made him wonder if she wasn't just a victim in this story. So you're hunting them? He asked quietly, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer. Taya looked away, her face shadowed with a mix of determination and regret. I have to, she said firmly. I can't just sit by and do nothing. They took everything from me. My husband, my home, my peace. If I don't do something, if I don't make them pay for what they did, then what's the point? I'll never be able to live with myself. James felt a rush of emotions, sympathy, fear, concern, all battling within him. He understood her anger, her need for justice. But at the same time, he was afraid for her. She was putting herself in danger by chasing these men, and she was bringing that danger right into his home. I don't want you to get hurt, he said softly. I don't want you to keep going down this path. There's always another way. Revenge doesn't bring peace, Taya. It just leaves more destruction. Taya looked at him, and for a brief moment, James thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a cold resolve. I don't know what else to do. It's the only thing that makes sense anymore. James didn't know how to respond to that. He could see that Taya was trapped in her own pain, her own need for vengeance, and that nothing he said would change her mind. She had already made her decision. The path she had chosen was one of revenge, and no matter what he said, it was clear she wasn't ready to let go. The silence in the room stretched on again, the crackling of the fire the only sound. James felt a knot of unease in his stomach. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he could sense that the storm outside was not the only thing that was about to break. The storm within Taya, the storm of grief, rage, and vengeance, was only just beginning to stir, and he wasn't sure if anyone would be safe once it finally came to a head. The morning light finally broke through the thick clouds, casting a pale glow over the landscape outside. The storm had passed, but the air was heavy with the aftermath. The ground was soaked, and the wind still carried a chill. James Callahan stood at the window, looking out at the stillness, his mind heavy with thoughts of the night before. He had gone to bed later than usual, unable to shake the feeling that something was about to change. Inside the cabin, Ellie was still asleep in her bed, her small form curled up under a pile of blankets. She had been exhausted from the previous day, her innocent questions and the strange newness of Taya's presence taking a toll on her energy. James watched his daughter for a moment, feeling a quiet sense of peace as he saw her so calm and safe. Taya, however, was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't joined them for breakfast. and the absence of her presence left a lingering tension in the air. James wasn't sure where she had gone, but he had a nagging feeling that it had something to do with the conversation they had shared the night before. He couldn't stop thinking about the fire in her eyes when she talked about the men who had killed her husband. The thirst for revenge that had overtaken her seemed to shadow every part of her, and it made James uneasy. Taya had mentioned her need to finish what she started, her quest to hunt down those who had taken her husband's life. But there was something dangerous in her words, a fierce determination that spoke of a path she had already committed herself to. James knew he couldn't change her mind, but he couldn't sit idly by either. He had to protect his daughter, and that meant making sure Taya wasn't putting them all in harm's way. After a while, he decided to go looking for her. He made sure Ellie was still asleep before quietly slipping out the door. The morning air was fresh, though still damp from the night's rain. James walked toward the barn, his boots crunching against the wet ground, and then he spotted her. Taya was standing near the edge of the property looking out over the horizon. Her posture was tense, her body as still as a rock, and she had her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked like she was lost in thought, staring at the distant hills, her mind a million miles away. James approached her cautiously, not wanting to startle her. He didn't know how she would react to him, especially after their conversation last night. But he also knew he couldn't just let her go without saying something. She had come to him for shelter, and that meant something. "Taya," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You didn't join us for breakfast. Is everything okay?" Taya turned slowly to face him, her expression unreadable. She didn't immediately answer, but after a moment she sighed deeply and lowered her gaze. "I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice distant. "I just needed some time alone." James studied her for a moment, trying to gauge what she was thinking. "I understand," he said, giving her a moment. "But I can't help but wonder, what's next for you? You said you're hunting down those men, but you've already been through so much. It's a dangerous road you're on, Taya, and I can't just watch you walk it without trying to help." Taya looked up at him, her eyes softening just a little. There was something vulnerable in her expression, something that James hadn't seen before. "I didn't come here to put you in danger," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stop. I have to do this. I have to finish it." James stepped closer, his boots making soft squelching sounds in the wet grass. "I understand why you feel that way," he said carefully. "But there's a fine line between justice and revenge doesn't heal the wounds. It only leaves more pain." Taya's eyes flashed with something, frustration or anger maybe, but she quickly masked it with a sigh. "I know what you're trying to say," she replied, her voice tinged with regret. "But you don't understand. You can't. They took everything from me. Everything I had. My husband, my home, my life. I don't know how to live without him. I don't know who I am anymore. I can't just walk away from this." James didn't know how to respond to that. He could see the weight of her words, the pain that was clearly driving her. He didn't blame her for feeling lost, for wanting to avenge the man she loved. But he also knew that vengeance wasn't the answer. "It never was, Taya," he said after a long pause. "I've lost someone too, my wife. I know what it's like to feel like you can't go on without them. But revenge, it's not the way to find peace. It only keeps you trapped in the past, and I don't want to see you trapped there." Taya looked at him, her face softening slightly, but her determination was still evident. "I can't just let them get away with it, James. I have to do this. I have to make sure they pay for what they've done." James felt a sharp pain in his chest, knowing that no matter how hard he tried to talk to her, he couldn't change her mind. He wanted to help, wanted to make things right for her, but he also knew he couldn't make her follow his path. She had already chosen hers. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy between them. James wanted to say more, to make her see that she didn't need to keep carrying this burden. But he knew that sometimes people had to come to their own conclusions, no matter how hard it was to watch. Finally, Taya spoke again, her voice quieter now. "I didn't want to drag you into this," she said, her gaze shifting to the ground. "I didn't want to bring danger to your doorstep. You've been kind to me more than I deserve. But I have to go. I can't stay here any longer. It's too dangerous for you, for Ellie." James hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to go alone," he said, his voice firm. "You don't have to do this by yourself. Let me help you." Taya shook her head slowly. "I can't put you in danger, I've already caused enough trouble by staying here. I can't involve you any further. It's better this way." James didn't know how to respond, but before he could speak, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind him. He turned to see Ellie standing at the door of the cabin, her small figure outlined by the light inside. She looked up at him and then at Taya, her face full of concern. "Is everything okay?" Ellie asked, her voice small but full of curiosity. Taya looked at the young girl and offered a soft smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything's fine, little one," she said gently. "I just needed some time to think." Ellie nodded, though she didn't look convinced. James could see the concern in her eyes. She was too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, but she was perceptive enough to know that something was wrong. James turned back to Taya. "Whatever you decide, just know that you're not alone in this," he said softly. "We're here for you, whether you like it or not." Taya seemed to soften at his words, though she still looked torn. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, and for a moment, James wondered if she would change her mind. But when she spoke again, her voice was steady, though tinged with sadness. "I appreciate your kindness, James," she said, her voice low, "but I have to do this. I can't stay here anymore. I need to finish what I started." James stood there for a moment longer, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he couldn't stop her. The storm had passed, but a different kind of storm was brewing, and Taya had already set her course. All he could do was watch and hope that she would find a way out of the darkness that had taken hold of her heart. The sun had fully risen now, its rays stretching across the land, turning the once gray sky into a soft shade of blue. The storm from the night before had left the air feeling fresh and cool, but the peaceful morning seemed to stand in stark contrast to the heaviness that hung in the air. James stood at the window looking out at the horizon. He could feel the tension building inside him. He had tried everything to convince Taya to stay, to put down her thirst for revenge, but it was clear she had already made up her mind. There was no changing it now. She was determined to follow her path no matter what. He had hoped that after their conversation yesterday, she might see reason, but instead, her resolve had only grown stronger. She had thanked him for his kindness, but there was a certain finality in her voice that made it clear she was leaving, whether he liked it or not. Ellie had woken up shortly after Taya had gone outside. She'd wandered into the kitchen, still rubbing her eyes. When she saw her father, she asked in a small voice, "Where's Miss Taya?" James paused, taking a deep breath before answering. "She's outside, sweetheart." "She's going to be leaving soon." Ellie's face fell at the mention of Taya's departure. She had become so attached to the quiet woman in just the short time they had spent together. She could sense that Taya was troubled, and yet Ellie had found comfort in her company, even though she hadn't fully understood the sadness that seemed to surround her. "Why?" Ellie asked, her voice full of innocence and confusion. "I thought she was going to stay with us for a while." James knelt down to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes people have to leave, Ellie. Sometimes they have their own things they need to do. And even though we might want them to stay, we have to respect their decision." Ellie nodded, though she didn't seem to fully understand. "Will she come back?" James hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. He had no way of knowing what the future would hold. "I don't know," he said finally. "But we'll always remember her kindness, and we'll hope that she finds what she's looking for." Ellie didn't seem completely satisfied with that answer, but she accepted it and returned to her room to gather her things. James stood there for a moment longer, staring out the window. His heart felt heavy with the knowledge that Taya was leaving, and yet there was a part of him that understood. She couldn't stay here forever. She had her own journey to finish, and he couldn't hold her back from it. As the morning stretched on, James decided to go outside and speak with Taya one last time. He didn't want to leave things unresolved. He wanted her to know that no matter what, she wasn't alone. The world could be a cold place, but there was always room for kindness and understanding. Taya was near the barn again, her back to him, staring out at the open fields. She seemed lost in thought, her posture as stiff as it had been the day before. James approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Taya," he called out softly. She turned around, her face a mixture of sadness and determination. There was no anger in her eyes, no resentment. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of her grief, her mission, and her inner turmoil. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself more than to him. James nodded, trying to steady his emotions. I know, but I want you to know something before you go. Taya raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this, James said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. You've been through so much, and it's easy to feel like the world is against you. But there are still people who care. You've seen that here in this house. I don't want you to carry that pain by yourself. Taya looked down at the ground, her fingers running through the dirt beneath her boots. I've been carrying it for so long, James. I don't know how to let go of it. James could see the weight of her words. She had been living with her grief for so long it had become part of her, and letting go of that kind of pain wasn't something that could be done easily. But there was still a part of her that wanted to find peace. He could see that in her eyes even if she wasn't ready to accept it yet. You don't have to let go all at once, he said softly. Healing takes time and it's not a straight path. But you don't have to walk it alone. There are people who care about you even if it's hard to see it right now. Taya looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. You don't know what it's like, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know what it feels like to lose everything. James was quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. No, I don't know exactly what it's like, but I've lost someone too. And I know that sometimes the only thing that keeps you going is the hope that things will get better, even if it's hard to believe that at first. Taya seemed to absorb his words, but she didn't say anything for a long while. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on the ground as if trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but steady. I've been chasing something, James. I've been chasing a feeling of justice, a way to fix what happened, but I've learned that I can't change the past, and I can't keep running from it either. James felt a shift in her tone, a subtle change that told him she was beginning to understand something about herself. He didn't know what it was, but he could see it in the way she stood, just a little less tense, a little less burdened. You don't have to chase revenge, Taya, he said gently. The past can't be undone, but you can choose how you move forward. And there's no shame in choosing peace. Taya looked at him, and for a moment their eyes met in quiet understanding. She nodded slowly, though there was still a sadness in her expression. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive, she said quietly. But maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to forgive myself. James gave her a small, encouraging smile. That's a good start. For a long while they stood there in silence, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The air had warmed, and the world around them seemed peaceful again, as if the storm from the night before had never happened. I'll never forget your kindness, James, Taya said finally. I don't know where I'll go or what comes next, but I'll always remember that you gave me a chance when I needed it. James felt a weight lift from his chest. You don't have to thank me. You're always welcome here, Taya, no matter what. She nodded, offering a small, genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a step forward. Taya turned to leave, her footsteps slow but determined. James watched her for a moment, knowing that her journey was far from over. But for the first time, he believed that she might be able to find some peace. Ellie emerged from the cabin, her small face bright with curiosity. Is Miss Taya leaving? She asked. James nodded, though his heart felt heavier than it had before. Yes, sweetheart. She's going on her own path now. Ellie was quiet for a moment, and then, as if trying to make sense of it, she asked, Will she be okay? James looked out at Taya's disappearing figure, a soft sigh escaping him. I hope so, Ellie, I really do. As Taya disappeared into the distance, James knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. The journey ahead for both of them was still uncertain, but at least now they each had a little more hope to carry with them.